Good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening. Welcome to this webinar session. I'm Tony Schönenberger. I'm the co-founder and executive chairman of STARS. As you know, as many of you know, STARS is a global platform for dialogue to discuss developments which will impact the society as a whole and our businesses in the next couple of years. No doubt, geopolitical intelligence is a must for any business leader. So today we are starting a new webinar series. The next 4 or maybe even 5 webinars will focus on India. India is a rising power, possibly the 3rd largest economy before 2030. But will India's complexity and internal divisions slow it down as was the case in the past? We want to deepen our understanding of India. So today we have the great privilege to talk to Raja Mohan. Raja, welcome. Good to have you on this webinar.
Thank you, Tony. Great to be here with all of you.
Raja Mohan is a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the NUS Singapore. He was and is associated with several Indian think tanks and universities in India, Singapore, and the US. Raja also served on India's National Security Advisory Board and publishes widely on India's foreign and security policies and Asian geopolitics. Last but not least, Raja was a speaker at the last STARS Singapore Symposium, actually last June. So thank you very much again, Raja. We are very much looking forward to your insights. We have now approximately 30 minutes to discuss with Raja. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. And I would strongly recommend to do it as quickly as possible. So let's start. First question. India has a huge potential, particularly looking at the Indian economy. Largest population, size of the market, huge pool of talents, for instance, in the IT area, etc. So India, as I said before, could become the 3rd largest economy by 2030. And the question to you, Raja, would be, what are the domestic challenges right now?
I think India is well on its way to becoming the 3rd largest economy by the end of this decade. In fact, even on a conservative estimate of about 6.5 to 7% growth rate, I think India would double its income, double its aggregate GDP by the end of this year. But I think in India, there will always be domestic issues. I think in the past, the ideological orientation of India's domestic politics towards the left and the socialist paths tended to constrain India's potential to grow faster. I think India has overcome that barrier, but yet we must remember that while India's GDP today is around $4 trillion, the per capita GDP is still below $3,000. Which tells you the task of building the nation, the task of stitching together a fairly diverse. Think of Europe as a single country and trying to put it all together into a single state. So that challenge remains. I think, but luckily India, I would say last 20 years in the 21st century has had a reasonably stable governments. We had Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who ran the prime ministership for 6 years. Manmohan Singh for 10 years, Mr. Modi is in his 11th year. So I think the political stability is there. And the recent economic initiatives, I think, promise, even in the worst case, that India would get to $7 trillion by 2031.
There is now the rise of the National Congress, meaning there is now a coalition government, obviously. What are then the consequences for the government of President Modi, and what after Modi?
Yeah, I think we've had coalition governments before. And in fact, much of the initial reforms in India in the reform era starting 1991 were done by coalition governments. In fact, Mr. Modi's government last 2 terms was really the first single party government in a very, very long time. This time, there is a coalition. He doesn't have majority of his own. And he has 2, 3 coalition partners. At this point, it looks like those coalition partners have no major ideological differences with the BJP. So I expect the government to be reasonably stable. And Mr. Modi has been signaling that he wants to do big things, major reforms. So I think some of that will go on, but I think the style of functioning will change. Mr. Modi, with absolute majority in the last 2 terms, could almost run by diktat. That is, but with shock and awe. But this time, he has to be more accommodative, more accommodating, and that we are already beginning to see that he has to consult, he has to take other parties into consideration if he wants to do big things.
Running to economics quickly, is India really now the place to be for foreign business? Meaning, on the one hand, you see companies like Apple investing in India. On the other hand, you also see that foreign investors find India, to a certain extent, a difficult place to do business and, for instance, go to Vietnam. What is your perception?
Look, I think the experiences with India, of course, are never, uniform. There's always going to be issues. I mean, India is not a China. I mean, I don't think you should expect that a single party or an authoritarian government can simply deliver the trade unions, have total command over all domestic politics, that it can deliver the kind of safety and security that capital would want. But in India, within this chaos of diversity, your multiple parties, one party at the national level, other parties at state level, so that I think will remain. So, but the question is, are the companies inside India making more money? Are they profitable? That I think is not a wrong thing to say. That I think those who manage to get in and begin to establish companies have done well. But there'll always be issues. The question is, the entry is hard, perhaps, into India. But I think many of them, those who come into India, like including Apple, it was not clear 3 years ago that they would actually succeed in setting up manufacturing in India, but they have. So I would say that you have to bet on India to some extent, because there's no other country with the kind of size and scale that India offers. And the technical manpower and skills that it has. Vietnam doesn't have the scale. It's not even clear, how far Vietnam will do its reforms given the structure, the struggle in the party itself. So I would say if India is a large economy out there are not many areas that are growing. Europe has a deep structural crisis, both demographic and the question of growth, and the question of coping with new technologies. So I think whether you like it or not, I would say some engagement with India, with all its difficulties, becomes necessary for diversification of the various interests that the European capital has. So I would say it should be one important factor in the calculus. Where in the world would you invest? I'm sure you would certainly want to keep some in Southeast Asia, but some of the advanced areas you would also want to invest in India.
So you would say that India is really an alternative to China regarding supply chains?
I think it's beginning to happen. So, but I don't want, as I said, look, shouldn't compare India to China. 40 years of China's economic integration into the West, the shift of low-wage factories from Southeast Asia, from the old Four Tigers, from Taiwan and Hong Kong into China, gave it a boost of the kind, and then it built itself on that ground. So you're not going to have as simple a framework, but I think given the geopolitical situation today, where the US is looking to see India as a major node in the restructured global economy, and in India that grows at 6 to 7% will continue to be an attractive destination for rearranging the global economic order. I don't think you can completely dissociate yourself from China. Nor will India do that, nor will the US do it. But I think the need to diversify, the need to have greater balance in the way the global economic activity is distributed, that I think is now a political necessity.
Turning to foreign policy, I remember India's foreign minister, Jaishankar, said once, I'm a convinced nationalist. What does this actually mean, and what are India's interests?
Look, I think nationalism might be a bad word in Europe, but it is not a bad word in Asia. That I think much of Asia, and if you ask any Asian countries, are you nationalists? They'll say, of course we are. After all, we've only decolonized 75 odd years ago from European imperialism. So therefore, nationalism is not something that is seen as negative. The question in the context, Mr. Jaishankar is saying, he's actually saying I'm more of a nationalist than the Congress party. He's saying his party is more determined to lift India up, will do, bring in more energy, better policies to make India a major power. And I think that's where the nationalism is being mobilized in India today to accelerate the economic growth, to become a major technological hub, and to expand the production of advanced goods within India. So I think that's the context in which he's saying. But India is also internationalist. It is today closer than ever before to the US and increasingly to Europe and to other US allies in Asia. And I think India, as its size grows, its economic size grows, I think its contributions to international order will continue to rise. But in the near term, there are issues. We have serious conflict with China. So I'll be happy to talk about that. And we have a legacy dependence on Russia. So we can talk about those two issues as well.
Yes, that would be great. Could you please deepen a little bit the relationship India and China right now? It seems to be, from Europe, there is a kind of a rapprochement, maybe, but how would you define it, the relationship?
Look, I think the relationship in the last 4 years has been pretty bad. Ever since the military conflict, which saw deaths on both sides in June 2020, these battles took place in the high Himalayas at around 17,000 feet. And since then, both sides have deployed huge amounts of military facing each other at this uninhabitable space of 15,000 to 17,000 feet. So there's been huge amount of tension. But the two sides, India has completely cut off political dialogue. It is trying to reduce its economic exposure to China. It has imposed some economic measures against China, but it has kept up a military dialogue, which is say, look, how do we resolve this issue? I think these talks have gone on for almost 20 odd rounds. Now, in the last few weeks, there is some expectation that we might see a disengagement, completing the disengagement of the military, which is actually at many places face to face. So if Delhi and Beijing succeed in doing that, there's expectation that when Mr. Modi meets Xi Jinping, either on the margins of the BRICS or the East Asia Summit or the G20, there might be a moment to solve some of the problems. So that would open up space for diplomacy. Right now, there's not much space for diplomacy. So disengaging the two militaries would create space for engagement, political and economic and other. But that does not mean the structural contradictions between India and China have been sorted out. No. As two large neighbors with deep territorial dispute and the friction coming from simultaneous rise, those contradictions are really deep. And China thinks India has gone too close to the Americans. India thinks China cuts no quarter for its neighbors in Asia. So I think we have a huge amount of differences. And India thinks China's economic policies are harmful to India because we have a $100 billion trade deficit. So I would say the structural challenges are many. But the good news is we might be beginning to find a way out of the current impasse so that we can talk about the larger issues. And that could happen in the next few weeks. But I would say headlines are too optimistic, I think. We got to see whether Xi Jinping actually, Xi Jinping has not been nice to any one of China's neighbors, whether it is Japan, whether it is Philippines. So I'm not so sure that he would suddenly be generous to India, because that's something I'll believe it when I see it.
You also mentioned Russia. Why this close cooperation with Russia, particularly after the war against Ukraine? On the other hand, you are part of the Quad, but not participating at the sanctions against Russia. Can you deepen the relationship India-Russia a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's a long historic one. I think many of our European friends find it very hard to understand why is India so close to Russia. I think that takes you back to 100 years when European colonial powers were unwilling to decolonize. There were only two countries that supported decolonization at the beginning of the 20th century. One was Soviet Union, Mr. Lenin's support for decolonization, and other was Mr. Woodrow Wilson, who said we are for freedom of nations. But I think the US thing didn't work out. But Russia's rise, Soviet Union's rise, and the beginning of India's national movement, and all across Asia, it's not just India. So there was a lot of goodwill for Soviet Union. That Soviet Union stood for progressive forces. It supported the sovereignty and integrity of developing countries. But of course, most of us in Asia, we have no sensibility to Russian imperialism, of Russian expansionism within Europe. That I think it's a huge gap in our knowledge about Europe. And I think if you tell anyone, look, the kind of things Russia has done in Europe, very few people are willing to, most people will find blank faces. So I think there is a blind spot to Russia's role in Europe, which is dominant, hegemonic. So there it is, that's one. Second, I think in the Cold War, given the Anglo-American and the European support to Pakistan and later China, which were at odds with India, so we had a lot of Soviet support on those issues. So there again, for India in particular, the Cold War produced more goodwill for Russia. But today what we see is really that India can't suddenly switch off the relationship, just as the Europeans can't switch off from China, given the deep economic interdependence that you have. India depends on Russia for most of its weapons, almost even now, even after reduction, close to 70% of India's inventory is Russian weapons. So therefore, if you're locked in a conflict, the question is, how do we manage that? What we're doing is really Mr. Modi's emphasis on domestic production of weapons, more diversification, working more closely with the Americans, Israelis, the French, and the Europeans. So we're trying to diversify, but I think that will take time. But I would say Russia's weight in India is going to go down over a period of time. But at this point, it is still there. And on the sanctions, look, I think India supports multilateral sanctions, but it is not ready to be in a general policy of supporting unilateral one. And I think given the specific problems that we have. And the question of oil purchases, which everyone talks about, oil purchases are not under sanctions. They're not barred. What is barred is the price cap. There is a price cap. India's purchase of oil is under a price cap. So therefore, I don't think India is defying any specific sanctions. And the Indian private sector is quite careful and not to get entangled in the American sanction system. So therefore, I think what we do with Russia is most of it is kosher apps.
Turning to geopolitics, obviously today's world is somehow dominated by the West. How do you see the significance or the emerging significance of the global South?
I'm two different parts to it. I think the relative weight of the West is declining. And there is a G7. I was just reading a study by CSIS in Washington. From almost 70% of the global GDP in 1990, today the G7 today barely touched 40% of the global GDP, and with only 10% of the world population. So you have actually the rise of the so-called non-West is impressive. But here is the problem. But I'm a skeptic of the global South because the global South is divided. There is a lot of fear in Europe, a lot of hope in parts of developing countries that the barbarians will come to the beautiful European garden. the global south and the BRICS will overthrow the European system. Look, I think the fact that India and China don't get along, we can both say we have a global south. We have huge territorial disputes. China has territorial disputes with Philippines, which is from the global south. It has disputes with Vietnam, which is from global south. So this notion that somehow we can bring in all the global south, I mean, this is a fantasy of the Russians and the Chinese. Somehow they can use the old anti-imperialist slogans to bring the non-Western countries for their geopolitical game with the West. So India sits in the BRICS, but it is not willing to play that game because its contradictions mainly are with the Chinese. Whether we don't say it so explicitly, the governments, but there you are. Take, for example, now it's almost a year since the terror attacks on Israel. And what Israel has done to Gaza since then is quite something. But yet, the Abraham Accords have survived. You might have students protesting in Colombia and Paris, but the fact is, for the Gulf countries, for a lot of Arabs, the problem is with Iran. So even on the Palestinian question, which is probably, you can't get more base than that. It is good and bad is so clear at one level. But even on that question, you can't unite the Arabs against Israel. So I think these are contradictions. And I would just conclude by saying, look, we had the non-aligned movement. We had the Arab League. We had the Organization of Islamic Countries. We had Pan-Asian conferences. Every one of them could not unite people either on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of religion, on the basis of economic status. So I think the West is smart. It'll cultivate friends in the non-West. It'll accommodate some, like India or others, to be partners. But framing it as West versus the South, I don't think that's going to work. And within the West itself, the US is doing better than Europe. So US has stayed, really, US weight in the global system remains steady at 26%. So Europe that has declined, Japan that is declining. So I think it's more complicated. And I would say the smart policy would be to build partnerships, reach out to parts of the global South so that they're not turning in anger to Russia and China.
In this context, there is a question from the audience. India is a democratic country. While other BRICS countries are becoming more and more autocratic, is India still at the right place in the BRICS?
In international politics or even companies, unless you go completely broke, you don't dissolve organizations. So there was a reason why India joined the BRICS back in the 1990s, the fear of the unipolar movement. That time, our French friends also used to talk about hyperpower, what American power would do. So the fear that the US would use its unipolar movement to undermine India's interests, whether it is on the question of nuclear weapons, whether it's on the question of Kashmir. That's what India gravitated towards Russia and China to say, look, we need to create some kind of a balance to the unipolar moment. But today, I think our problems don't come from the US. Our problems come from China. So therefore, India talks about a multipolar Asia while we talk about a multipolar world. So I think it's a path dependence that keeps us there. You could say, to use a crude example, let me say, India is probably like the British in the EU. We are the poison pill that keeps things from going too far out against the West.
Could you please elaborate a little bit on India's role in the emerging multipolar world?
Again, I think I'm skeptical of the multipolar world. I mean, there is a lot of new actors have risen, but as I said, look, the US is still the dominant power. The US retains 26% of the global GDP. Much of the technological innovation continues to come from the US. Eurozone as a collective has declined to about 70% of the US. Recent commission report of Draghi is essentially saying EU needs to regain its competitiveness to be able to compete with the new challenges. So I think the question is not whether all the others are going to gang up. As I said on the question of multipolarity, that China can't gang up against the West. In fact, I would say much of the BRICS, everyone is trying to cut a deal with the Americans. The question is the terms. The Russians want a sphere of influence, and they know that only the Americans can give them. So I think it is not as if the West has lost ground or the US has lost ground. Europe has lost ground, certainly. So I would say the multipolar world is a political aspiration, it's a campaign, it's a political slogan. But the weight of the US gives a lot of options. But of course, I mean, you can't stop the Americans from squandering that power. The nature of its politics is always doing it. But if you go to the basics on the numbers, the US is still way ahead of everyone. And I think they have the choices by making marginal adjustments to their policy. They can actually shape the international system, continue to shape the international system in a very substantive manner.
What are your expectations now, or what is the impact of the US elections, generally speaking, on geopolitics and particularly on India and its strategic partnership with the US?
Look, I think generally we've had a very good run with the Americans since 2000 when Bill Clinton came to India, almost after a gap of 2 decades. Since then, I think every administration in the US and every political government in Delhi have got along well. The relationship has never been as good as it is. In fact, we have a Quad meeting and a bilateral meeting this weekend in Wilmington, Delaware. So the relationship has grown. And I think it is generally confident that it can, whichever candidate wins the election, India is in a good position because India has dealt with Trump. We had good relations with Trump. And the Biden administration, assuming Kamala will largely continue those policies. But I think there are more structural challenges that exist. I mean, I just mentioned 2 issues. One is the trade issue. Mr. Trump, some of the ideas that he has, 100% tariff, 60% tariff on China, maybe 10% on others. And even 2 days ago, Mr. Trump made something, he said, I want to meet Modi, he's a great guy. But at the same time, he says, look, India is an abuser of the global trading system. So I think his unpredictability, I know Europeans have bigger worries than us. At least we don't have the security concern because India is not an ally, unlike the Europeans and the Asians. So I would say, but the economic issue is an important one for us. How we deal with that trade issue would be quite significant. The second is the immigration issue. I know immigration has become toxic in the US. It's also toxic in Europe. I think the challenge for there, I would say, really, it's not just about immigration across the board, whether it's in Europe or North America. It is about good immigration and bad immigration. Both Europe and US need skilled immigration. You need talented people to come and fill a whole lot of things, in which I think India is on a good wicket. Much of the recruitment of Indians takes place at the enterprise level, that is businesses. And this is not family reunions and that kind of stuff that goes on or for political reasons. So I would say India would structurally, I would say that Indian migration will not be affected as much as the other source of migration might be. But still, I think India needs to understand that immigration is a toxic issue. And I think India is beginning to work with the Europeans and the Americans, negotiating agreements called migration and mobility, where we work with the West to control, prevent, counter illegal immigration, while actually working with them, facilitating movement of technical talent across borders.
We are running out of time, so last and final question to you, Raja. Where do you see India in 2047?
Well, Prime Minister has an ambition. He wants India to be a developed country. That means getting to at least $10,000, $12,000 per capita. Growth will take place. I think 2047 will be 100 years of India's independence. So I think it's an exhortation. It's a goal. So I would say even if we go 3/4 of the distance, if we hit even $10,000 per capita, we'll continue to grow. I think that will be a phenomenal achievement. And I think that is doable. At least most economists now say 12,000, 13,000 might be hard, but a $10,000 per capita income should be within the reach. And India that gets there to 25, eventually $20 trillion, $25 trillion, I think India will need to take a lot more responsibility for the management of the international system to contribute to the maintenance of the global order, to work with our partners in the international system. So I'm not a fan of India becoming another pole, but I think the next 30 years, next 20 years, certainly, India will need to much closer partnerships with the West to accelerate its economic growth, to have capital flows, to have technological development. In all these areas, I would think India's relationship with the West will continue to grow and deepen in the coming years.
Thank you very much. Time is up, unfortunately. First, I want to thank you very much for these brilliant insights. I think we all learned a lot about India, about geopolitics, and about the challenging developments in India. One message is clear: expect the unexpected. So, Raja, I wish you all the best, and I look very much forward to having you again at the STARS events.
Thank you. It's wonderful being here with you.
Thank you. Thank you. The next webinar will be on 4th of October. It will be with Herbert Dieter, a European expert on India. I hope to see you there. Goodbye and till soon.